Okay, thanks to you both, Barbara, and to Todd for joining us this morning. Let's just jump right into things. I appreciate you guys taking the time today. Obviously, 101 Ash Street is in the news, so let's just jump right into that issue. Todd, you were on the council when that deal was approved, and let me just read some of these quotes that I'm sure you've heard a lot by now. At a committee meeting, here you said that everything about this, I think, really sends a strong message to taxpayers that we kind of got our stuff together around here. And later, when it came time for the council to approve this, or excuse me, I got that backwards. That was your quote at council and at committee. This is a better business arrangement for taxpayers and uses their money a little bit more appropriately than leasing. It's a win all the way around. You know, our editorial board has called that the worst city real estate deal in city history now. So I guess my question for you is, what role, what responsibility do you feel that you have in that arrangement?
I voted for the acquisition in the same way that Councilmember Bree voted for the remodel. And I think both of us, our decisions were only as good as the information that was provided to us. The comments that you cited came from the representation that the building was in good condition. We know that not to be the fact. That we were removing 800 employees in there basically overnight. That didn't happen. And that we would have the ability to save $40 million. And after a $30 million remodel, most of those savings evaporated. Obviously, the deal has not held up well over time. I take responsibility for my role in that. I think every council member, these votes were all unanimous, owe some responsibility to that. And I think the editorial board has correctly identified the mayor and his staff as being primarily responsible because they are the folks that arranged the deal, brought the information forward. I did everything I could as a council member to ask questions on the record, to take informational briefings, to participate in the hearings, to try and get to whether or not this was a good deal. And at the time, we as a city were facing escalating lease payments for rented facilities. We had inadequate facilities that were city-owned, like the DSD building that we have real problems with and still have real problems with. And that it seemed that we were moving in a direction where we were going to be owners, not renters, that we were going to treat our employees a bit better, and we were going to save the taxpayers some money. A lot of that has not come true, but that was the information as I understood at the time. This was information that our independent budget analysts supported. And again, what we know now in hindsight is not a lot of that information. I think the question is, what's the next mayor of San Diego going to do about it? I have some ideas about that if you want to hear about that now, or if you want to.
Yeah, let me ask you first about the due diligence, because that seems to be the big question. We basically took someone else's word for the condition and the worth of that property. Why, as a council member who made the decision, didn't you think to ask for more information?
Well, I did ask on the record, about the condition of the building, and it was represented to us that it was in excellent condition. And that was the representation of our staff. Now, I think what I understand now is we should have asked, well, what is that based on? Is that based on your cursory walkthrough of the building? Is that based upon an independent review of the conditions, or is that the seller's representations? We asked our staff for what they believe the building needed, and of course has been quoted multiple times. This building is turnkey. All it needs is a power wash. That, of course, has not proven to be true. And I think it became exacerbated when the city chose to try and cram several hundred more employees into that building, basically 2 years later, and then through the course of a remodel of exposing asbestos and harming workers. What the council that I was a part of voted to do, and what ultimately has happened, have been two different things. And the common denominator in this situation is the mayor's office in terms of whether or not they were managing this project the way it was told to the council and to the public, and what happened over time. Could we have asked more questions? In retrospect, yeah. I mean, when I look at the tape, I understand that when I was being told that this building was in a particular condition, that was not our independent assessment. That was the assessment of the seller, and that, of course, is wrong. And I think the employees who made those representations now no longer work at the city. But the question is, where does the responsibility end up? If I'm the next mayor of San Diego, I've had a sign on my desk for 20 years that says the buck stops here. I haven't necessarily heard that so much from this administration. And I think that that's a part of the change I want to represent if elected San Diego's mayor.
Thanks, Todd. Barbara, for you on the responsibility question, let me just read a quote from you. When you actually seconded the motion to spend 30 million on the redo, on the remodel, and you said, in business, you look at something as a sunk cost at this point. Is it a sunk cost, kind of specifically, because that means that you're committed to the building as is now? And what role do you have in this particular vote? The problems came to light after, of course, the building was opened up.
So let's go back in time. In July 2015, Sandy Shapery sold half of the building to Doug Manchester for $20 million. So that would mean the building at that time was perceived to have been worth about $40 million. A year and a half later, it was appraised at $62 million, and Sistera wanted to sell it to the city in a lease purchase at $72 million. What's clear as we go back in time is that city staffers, advisors, and leaders, including Todd, knowingly participated in an above market lease, using taxpayer money and allowing Sistera to finance this purchase. And the financing was based on the city paying the rent. It was not based on the appraisal. Furthermore, I went back and looked at the agreement that the city approved at that time, and it was easy to find page 1, and it was easy to find the abnormal indemnity language that indemnified the seller from everything. If there had been normal indemnity language, none of the issues today would be irrelevant, because Sistera would be, or the real owners of the building at the time would be liable. Mr. Gloria was briefed about all of this or there was a brief. He was the only member of that committee, of the land use committee, who was briefed. Both Lori Zaff and David Alvarez have said they were not briefed ahead of time. That's in a La Prensa article that ran yesterday. I'd like to know what Mr. Gloria was told at the September 16th briefing and who attended it. All along, I have been demanding transparency, a release of all documents. I haven't seen some of the recent reports that have been referenced in media articles, and I released a statement yesterday that it's time for the city attorney and the mayor to release everything related to this tortured transaction. Why did it have to be a complicated lease purchase? At the land use committee, Mr. Gloria was clearly told that it was costing the taxpayers extra money to do this. So why did it proceed forward? Why did it have to get done so quickly? What was the rush?
I didn't hear you say whether you took responsibility or not for your vote. Do you not?
I take responsibility for trying to make the best out of a bad purchase. This building was clearly a bad purchase that the city never should have done in the way that it did it. And I hold city officials accountable who were there at that time, including Mr. Gloria, who made the motion at the land use committee, who made the motion at the city council, who should have understood that the city was paying above the appraised value for the building, and that it was entering into a very complicated lease purchase, because that was the only way the financing could be available. The city could not get financing based on a $72 million purchase price, because that was higher than the appraisal.
Do you regret your vote, Barbara? And do you apologize to San Diego after making it?
I will make it right as mayor.
Todd, do you regret your vote? And would you apologize to San Diego for making it?
I do regret my vote, in the sense that obviously there is tremendous costs that we're now looking at. You know, if it's $115 million to get that building into a useful condition, that is not what I wanted. That's not what I voted to support, and yet this is where we are. And again, I think leadership is about taking responsibility. In terms of apologizing, well, of course, I'm not happy where things are at. And, you know, as someone who believes passionately in public service, to the extent that this undermines people's confidence in our city's ability to do work, I mean, actually counter to what I believed we were doing when we took this vote. Yeah, I'm not happy with that at all. But again, I think what we have here, both in the comments that were just made, as well as the mayor's comments to date, is a reluctance to understand how we got here and whether or not we're willing to do what it takes to make it right. I'm committed to doing precisely that. It is clear that this is not a one-off. You may get to it, but obviously the indoor skydiving facility, which is under federal investigation, is of concern. The Othello Avenue property that was purchased by this city council is also a significant challenge in terms of land use decisions. It is clear that there is problems with the way the city manages and acquires property, and the next mayor has to bring wholesale change to that. Believe me, I will take the lessons learned from my experience as 101 Ash and do better for San Diego because we have to have a functioning real estate assets department that delivers for this people, and currently we do not have that.
Let me ask you both about real estate assets specifically. Obviously, that department has been in the headlines for decades, right? It's been a mess. We've been asking for a roster of real estate and people in charge who make wise decisions. How would you approach that department, A, and B, who would you put in charge of it, and how would the voters know that is the right person for the job? Todd, why don't you go first?
Sure. Well, I don't have a name for you today. I'm applying for this job and hope to have the opportunity to hire a world-class team to help me manage the 8th largest city in this country. In terms of how we would do better, well, clearly it's going to start with new leadership of real estate assets. It's going to involve having the right kinds of support. I believe the city has an RFP out right now trying to solicit professional assistance. Based on my knowledge and my understanding, I don't believe the city's had that, at least in recent years. And obviously that's reflected in the deals that have been made. I think important that there has to be some level of transparency. I would hope to have a group of advisors who are real estate professionals who could help me take the recommendations of both staff of these consultants to make sure that I understand them completely backwards and forwards before bringing them to the city council for their ratification or not. I think that it involves a great deal of selection of better people. Obviously, the last real estate assets director was hired with the representation that she would be able to make this all better. Clearly that has not happened. And so it has to be more than just a different person in the director's position. It has to be a systems change, an invitation of more voices at the table to make sure that when something is wrong, that there's more of a chance that it gets caught. I think that we should all be concerned about the fact that these projects, 101 Ash, the skydiving facility, Othello Avenue, made it all the way through the process, and no one seemed to raise a red flag. It calls for a different approach, and that's the approach I would bring if elected mayor.
How about you, Barbara?
So first of all, I think this is why my private sector experience is so important. I've been involved in complex real estate transactions during my career, and I would do a national search to find a qualified director for the department. I would have an advisory group around me of real estate professionals who do not have a vested interest in dealing with the city. And this is a world I'm very familiar with. I understand what the various issues are. And I think it's also important to bring transparency and accountability. I mean, I've been very frustrated with real estate assets. I believe Sibel Thompson was in place when Todd was the interim mayor, so was Ron Villa. And it's clear we need professionals running our key departments at City Hall, not political appointees. And
Sybil was handpicked by Faulkner, correct?
That is correct. I did not appoint her.
Mm-hmm.
Todd, real quick on the meeting that La Prensa wrote about, you referenced that meeting in the committee meeting publicly, so it's not a surprise that you met with staff, but is it true that you were the only committee member who met with staff, and why was that?
Matt, forgive me, I can't comment on that because I don't know. Councilmember Bree a moment ago mentioned 2 council members. There's actually 4 members of that committee, so it doesn't seem as though the full look at that has happened. As Councilmember Bree could probably tell you, I certainly could explain, those briefings are often voluntary. Mayor's office will reach out and say, would you like a briefing on this particular matter? You know me, I'm a wonk, I'm a workaholic. I'm gonna take that meeting. This was in my district, so there's a special responsibility to take that. I don't have a clear memory of that particular meeting. These kinds of things happen with great frequency. Typically what comes is the relevant staff, the staff report, whatever PowerPoint slide or whatever, and they kind of go over it with you in advance. And that's basically what I can remember. You know, the representations of some nefarious shenanigans going on are not how I do my work. It is not what happened in that meeting.
Laura, you had a hand up to ask a question. You're muted.
It's already been answered. I was going to ask both of you what you want to see happen specifically with 101 Ash. But I think rather than go backwards, I think the way Matt phrased the question, I think I got an idea of what you both want going forward. So thank you.
Before we move on to other subjects, do other board members want to ask about 101 Ash? There's obviously a lot of ground to cover.
My question would be, how come the city keeps screwing up? We've got 25 years of amazing mistakes being made, including lots of things that have happened while Todd was on the council. So I just wonder, you know, why can't we have like a city that we can count on to competently function?
So Chris, I think that's a really good question. You know, I got to City Hall in 2016 after a career as a businesswoman in the technology center, and I was astonished to find a culture of no accountability, no transparency, and where major decisions are made behind closed doors. And I've stood up to it over and over again, starting with Soccer City, being the first elected official to oppose it, actually reading the 1,000+ page ballot measure, demanding an independent audit of the water department. And as issues with 101 Ash Street arose, I have been the first to demand accountability and transparency and to call it out. It is not fair to the taxpayers how City Hall has been run. And I have called it out since I got there, and I will bring in a new group of people, new voices at the table, who will be responsive to our residents and to our taxpayers, not the revolving door of people who have come from special interests and gone back and forth.
Chris, I think it's a fair question. And as a native San Diegan, I share your frustration. You know, I'm running expressly because I'm tired of us being a big city that acts like a small town, and that we continually make these sort of small town mistakes. And it's everything from what we've already discussed to stuff that this editorial board has commented on. The ticket guarantee, which was not on my watch. Proposition B, which was something that I campaigned against and my opponent supported and is now costing us hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, there's a continual pattern and practice. And I guess what I'm saying is I'm ready to take us in a different direction, to embrace the fact that we're the 8th largest city in the country, that we don't take freebie real estate advice, that we don't have someone come in from out of town and sell us on a ballot measure for pension reform that doesn't work. I mean, we've seen this happen over and over again. I want to be given the mandate to try and embrace the fact that we're the 8th largest city in the country and that we start acting like it.
Sticking with real estate, let's talk about the sports arena site. Obviously a huge piece of property, a lot of grand visions for that site. What should the Faulkner administration be doing before either of you is elected? Todd, why don't you go first?
Well, they've already indicated what they're going to do. I noticed this editorial board's comments on it, and I would just point out that it's my understanding that there's no way that his administration is going to make a determination or a recommendation to the city council. It's going to be left to the next mayor, and as it should be. Given the track record of this administration on real estate deals, we rightfully should be concerned about what kind of deal they would cut. There's also a world where hopefully they do better because they know that they need to improve their record, and perhaps they bring something forward that is worthy. My commitment is to hopefully win this election and then have the opportunity to review their work product. If it's something that I can support, something that I think is worthy of that site, something that I think will make good sense for taxpayers, then we'll bring it forward for the council's consideration. If it's not, I'll have no trouble whatsoever stopping negotiations and starting the process over. I think what we have to do as a community, though, is focus on first things first, which is Measure E. And it is a ballot measure that I support, that I think is important for maximizing the value of this taxpayer asset at a time when we have high unemployment and falling city revenues. And I think it's importantly, it's something that community wants. Many of you may know the Midway Community Planning Group is extremely supportive of this measure. So let's focus on first things first. Let's have the voters of San Diego make a determination of what they want to do with Measure E. If it passes, it's probably worth continuing the conversation with Brookfield. And again, if it's not something that I think is worthy, and you might anticipating a follow-up, I think Worthy involves a significant amount of affordable housing, both for low-income and working and middle-class San Diegans, something that is of high design, of world-class quality, something that is worthy of that site. And if it doesn't meet those high bars, then we'll move on. We'll say no, and we'll try again.
So do you support the current people that Faulkner has given the green light to?
So I've had a briefing with those folks to try and understand what they're proposing. Quite honestly, I don't have the level of detail to say yes to that particular question. I mean, obviously the mayor went through a competitive process, has arrived at these individuals. But again, what I'm hopefully saying very clearly is that even if he blesses it, it doesn't mean that he's the one that gets to move it forward. It's going to be Councilmember Bree or myself. And you're hearing from me what I would expect to see, which may be different than this current administration. And if that's the case, I suspect that we'll be starting over.
Barbara, how about you? What are your thoughts on this and what Kevin should be doing in the next 3 months and what you would do?
First of all, this is another rushed backroom real estate transaction. The mayor should have just left this issue for the next mayor. And most importantly, left it until the November ballot measure is passed or doesn't pass. So the 30-foot height limit is resolved one way or another. So as you know, there was only a 10-day public comment period during a pandemic. This is not the way the city should be dealing with one of its most precious pieces of land. Most importantly, what I've been calling for years is a city-wide real estate strategy. That includes looking at all the city real estate that we own or lease. What are we using it for now? What should we be using it for? How much do we really need? And that should have been done before we would do an RFP for the sports arena site, for Tailgate Park. We should be thinking about, where does an entertainment district belong? Should it stay in Midway? Should it be downtown? We have so many decisions we need to make as a community with public input before we can move forward with an RFP. As mayor, I will stop the process and go back to the drawing boards and first do the groundwork that we need to do with developing a citywide real estate strategy before issuing any RFPs for important pieces of city land.
So it sounds like you would go back to square zero, meaning this proposal would
Yes,
fall
I would
apart.
go back to square zero. This is another rushed real estate transaction during a pandemic. The sports arena has been there for many years. It can be there another year or so. It's important to get it right when it's precious city land. This is why I was so adamantly opposed to the Soccer City land grab. There was the mayor teaming up with a group of private investors to basically give away one of our most precious pieces of land without environmental review. And if you read the fine print, they would never pay a dime for it or build the river park.
And to be clear on Measure E, the height limit?
I oppose lifting the height limit. There is going to be a lot of other development in that community, specifically the Navwar site, the federal land, where they do not have a height limit because it is federal land. And the old federal post office is going to be, that land is going to be redeveloped. And all of that should be considered in totality. Raising the height limit is like doing spot zoning. What we were told at the council is the land would revert to what the land use was prior to the passage of, I think, Proposition D many years ago. And that could allow a building as high as 100 feet high in that area. And so I am opposed to lifting the 30-foot height limit.
Board members with other questions on the sports arena site?
I have a broader question on housing. Todd, as someone who wants more housing, I'm incredibly frustrated with Democrats who continue to focus on affordable housing, which is not affordable housing, $425,000 a unit. That's ridiculous. Instead of embracing things like container units. But Barbara, Dan Walters identified you as the leader of California's NIMBY movement. So as someone who wants gigantic progress on housing and soon, because that's the only way we're going to address California's poverty problem, I'm frustrated with both of you. Any response?
Chris, I'm happy to go first. First of all, look at my track record as a council member. I have voted to update community plans and add appropriate density along transit, Mission Valley, Morena Boulevard, the Balboa Corridor, Midway. Second, I've supported legislation allowing home property owners to add an accessory dwelling unit, a granny flat, and more recently to add a tiny home. I view the elimination of single family zoning as the wrong way to approach building more housing that's going to be affordable for working families. My opponent has supported state legislation that would essentially allow you to put 8 units on any single family home lot. Here's how I would address providing more housing that's more affordable. First, I want to revamp our development services department. It simply takes too long to get a permit where we know exactly what is allowed on that piece of land. Second, I want to look at creative reuse of office buildings and shopping centers. We are seeing a trend toward more people working remotely, and retailers are also, some sadly are going to go out of business. This is going to provide opportunities to reuse these buildings as residential in areas where we already have infrastructure. Third, I'm going to enforce our existing laws against short-term rentals. That's 16,000 single-family homes, plus hundreds of apartments that are being used as visitor accommodations. And fourth, I'm going to continue updating community plans. I mean, the Kearney Mesa plan is coming in the fall. I've talked with that community. They're very excited about the potential to develop, they call it an Asian Little Italy in a mixed use area with housing and office and restaurants. And fifth, I'm going to work on a down payment plan for first-time home buyers.
Chris, thank you for asking this question. And as you know, I'm passionate about housing issues. I want to just make clear, when there was this discussion earlier about a lack of a plan for the Midway, as Councilmember Bree just mentioned, they have updated the Midway community plan recently. There is a plan for that community. And, you know, as is often the case in this town, later often means never. And I think that that is something that should factor into the editorial board's decision-making when it comes to what kind of future we're going to have as a city. Chris, to your specific question, obviously, since we last met, and we've been having this conversation about the per door cost of affordable housing for a very long time. But since we last met, COVID and the resulting recession have obviously shot to the top of the list of things the next mayor's gonna have to focus on, but I appreciate you put housing on the table. Here's the thing. You are exactly right, and we do not have a disagreement on the fact that we must increase the amount of supply of housing in order to bring the cost down. Now, my Councilmember Bree has been extremely critical of state action. Now, this is a different position than what she had in 2016 when she was running for city council, but today she opposes action. But the legislation and the tiny homes and the accessory dwelling units often are authorized by state legislation, bills that I've supported or were supported before I got in the legislature. As we continue to try and address this issue from the state capitol, it is done with an acknowledgement that San Diego cannot solve the state of California's housing crisis by itself, and that we have to have communities that are less open to new housing than San Diego do their fair share. In the sense that some of my neighborhoods were concerned or continue to be concerned about accessory dwelling units, I think that with the proof of the additional permits that are being pulled to construct those, I don't believe you've seen a diminishment of neighborhood character. And it gets to your point, Chris, of housing that is naturally affordable without a public subsidy. We have to continue to find more ways to do that. How do I propose doing that? Well, I would say there's a number of things that we can do. We as a city have long had an affordable housing trust fund. But we actually have the production to show for it, roughly 4,000 permits issued in the last 10 years for subsidized low and very low income housing. We do not have similar production levels for middle income housing. You may know that roughly 33 permits were issued in the last 10 years for working in middle class San Diegans. I think this gets to your point, Chris. So if an affordable housing trust fund has helped to boost the number of units for low income San Diegans, well, why not have a middle income housing trust fund that could help finance and get these projects approved? Another thing that we can do, we have an affordable housing expedite program. If you're a developer proposing subsidized housing in the city of San Diego, you're supposed to get front of the line privileges. Well, again, we have a dearth of housing in the middle of the housing market. Why not provide a similar incentive in order to get more housing that people like Abby and Christy can actually afford, because people of your generation are being priced out? And then lastly, we should take every last bit of public property, and this is a concern I have. I was asked about mistakes that were made when I was on the city council. Let me put one on the table you haven't asked about. Every library and fire station and other property that we built, we should have put housing on top of it. We should have put housing on top of those things to take the land costs out of the deal, to make sure that the rents come down and the for sale prices come down. I think going forward, when we look at the city's inventory of real estate, we should be considering the fact that when we build a library, it should have 2-3 stories of housing above it that people can afford. There are many ways that we can get at this. The question is, do you have a mayor that wants to do this? And you have a choice between candidates that have a pro-housing platform or an anti-housing platform. Someone who says, they're coming for your homes, or there goes the neighborhood, and you know what that rhetoric means. And it's going to be extremely difficult to get neighborhoods to understand and embrace new housing if you're necessarily telling them that new housing will ruin their community. I am not saying that. I'm saying that I will hold developers accountable, that we're going to build at the part of the market that is not being addressed, and that we're going to make sure that it fits well into the community. That's how you get the housing at the part of the market you're talking about, Chris, and for a lot less than what they're currently what's currently costing.
So Chris, I think it's notable that the Building Industry Association has issued a dual endorsement in this race. They believe they can work with both candidates in moving forward with policies that will provide housing for working families. And second, There Goes the Neighborhoods is a title of a well-known podcast that discusses gentrification. And that's one of my concerns with the state legislation that my opponent has supported. If you look at community activists in South LA, they were vehemently opposed to SB 1120. They want to preserve their neighborhoods the way they want to preserve them in the way that they want, with local control. And San Diego is a model, and I have been on the council as we have moved forward with really good housing policies to try and make up for what former councils did not do.
Let me just ask you about the title of that podcast, because I know that appeared in a Michael Smollen's column recently, and you used that as by way of explanation. But when Andy Keats at Voice wrote about this issue before, you didn't introduce the concept of that podcast. So someone could read that. A cynic could read that and say that that's a convenient excuse.
I'm not responsible for what journalists write.
Okay. Laura.
Have that same issue going on in Barrio Logan. A lot of people are being pushed out that have been there for many, many years. What would either one of you do if you could just keep your answer brief to change what's going on?
So first of all, the Barrio Logan community plan the update needs to be finalized. I understand that's close to happening. As you know, this was a very contentious issue that went to the ballot in the special election after Bob Filner resigned. I don't understand why it's taken so long to bring forward a new community plan, and it's very frustrating to the residents and the business owners in that area that it has taken so long. But I think it starts with having a community plan and allowing that community to play a key role in deciding how it's wants to have future development.
Laura, that's a great question. And that is a bit of unfinished business from this mayor who promised that he would bring the Barrio Logan community plan update back for ratification by the city council. And he will have left office not having done that. And on the list of things that you all will evaluate him on come December, I hope that that would be among them, because that referendum was horrible. And you saw me campaign vigorously against it in trying to maintain the self-determination of that community who had worked for many, many decades without the benefit of a community plan, finally got one, only to be outdone by a handful of corporations. The fact that that has not been fixed is a failing of this administration. And to say that you don't know why it hasn't come forward at this point is also a failure of leadership currently. I would hope to, because I assume it's not going to get done in time, to be a mayor that brings this forward and gives Barrio Logan a pathway forward. And to your question about displacement, well, obviously the the process that comes from an updated community plan in terms of certainty of process and clear rules of the road, I think will make it more likely that we can have housing in that community, new housing that the existing residents can afford while accommodating new economic growth. Having that community basically unguarded as downtown has grown has of course caused the problems that you're discussing. And we anticipated that, we supported it by trying to pass the community plan. And the fact that it isn't on the books today is something that I think those who referendize this should be held accountable for, and those who've done nothing since then should be held accountable for.
Thank you.
Let me switch gears and ask you some questions about the police department. Obviously that's been in the news for a long time, but particularly in recent months with the racial protests that are unfolding nationwide. First of all, and I know I asked both of you this in the primary, but things have changed, so I want to just ask directly, do you support retaining Chief Nisleit? Todd?
I'm not going to make any personnel decisions here today. You know, I'm interviewing for the job of mayor. My answer that I gave you in the primary remains the same, but I do note some different context. And particularly, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, but the chief still has not accepted your invitation to sit down with this editorial board.
Correct.
And that would be, I would have a different expectation if I was mayor. And so, you know, I'm running with a vision of trying to make San Diego once again a national leader when it comes to policing. We once had that role not that long ago. We don't have it today. If the existing leadership of the department can sign up to try and meet that expectation, to be proactive in addressing concerns, not waiting until we have a tragedy in our own community, then I suspect that we'll find a way to work together. If they can't, we'll have to part ways.
Barbara?
Yes, I will sit down with the chief and make sure we have a shared commitment on, again, making San Diego a leader in community policing, on acknowledging that there are racial disparities in policing, on making sure that we recruit a department that reflects the diversity of our city, that we provide training, both the initial training at the police academy and continued training on appropriate use of force policies, and that we work toward making sure that everyone feels safe in their community.
Barbara, let me ask you about the police budget first, as you were on the council that just approved it. A lot of people, I can't remember in the history of council meetings, and I've been to quite a few over the years, having that many people interested in talking and at a meeting that lasted so long during a pandemic and they had to go through the logistical hurdles just to be heard. In the end, the council boosted the budget and just the numbers, I looked them up, about a $566 million budget. So it's about a third of the city's budget. 2,600 or so staff, which is about a third of the city's workforce. And 85% or so of the budget is wages, you know all this, is wages and benefits. So when people ask for a budget cut of $100 million to the police department, you're really talking about cutting personnel. So I guess my question for you is, what is it? Do you support the budget as stands, or do you think, as Monica Montgomery and many community members have said, that the budget deserves to be reduced dramatically?
I didn't vote to defund the police. That means I voted to support an appropriate budget that compensates our police officers fairly, that honors the pay raises that we already had awarded. And on a per capita basis, San Diego has many fewer police officers than other major cities around the country. We are fortunate to also have a low rate of crime. My goal as mayor is to take us back to being a leader in community-oriented policing. At the same time, I believe everyone, including police officers, need to be held accountable. That's why since 2018, I've supported an independent police review commission. In 2018, we did not have the votes to put it on the ballot. I was one of 4 votes. We needed a 5th vote. This time, it was unanimous to put it on the ballot. The environment around us has changed. But I took a political risk in 2018. I was very aware that the Police Officers Association, the labor union representing the police officers, would likely never endorse me again because of my stance on the Independent Police Review Commission. Nobody wants bad police officers. We all want good police officers who are properly trained, both at the beginning and during their career, and who work well with the community.
So what would the police budget look like in a Bree administration? Would it be bigger or smaller than it is currently?
I'm going to, as mayor, I'm going to step back and look at public safety in general with a group of advisors around me. How many calls do we get? What are they for? Who is the most appropriate professional to respond? So I'm going to look at public safety holistically before I make a commitment to a specific budget number.
Todd, what would the police department budget look like in your administration?
Well, I want to say from the beginning that I do not support defund the police. I think that's oversimplifying a very complex issue. And I'll come back to that in a second, but on a complex issue, there is an area of common ground between those who are protesting in the streets and those who support law enforcement or our police officers. And it's that we've asked too much of our police officers, that they've accepted more responsibility than they're comfortable with or they're trained to do. So I would hope that in the Gloria administration, we could achieve the consensus to transition responsibilities that our officers, again, are not the best and first persons that should respond to this. I'm thinking about calls for mental health emergencies, homelessness outreach, truancy sweeps. These are probably responsibilities that would be better left to folks who have more specific training to address this, perhaps with police backup in certain cases. But that's the kind of stuff where I think there is a level of consensus that could be reflected in a city budget in the not distant future. With regard to the levels of funding, here's how I look at it. What I just described would likely save money, right? We know that a police officer, even with our comparatively low pay relative to other jurisdictions, both in this county and this state, are still relatively expensive to run those calls. And that, transitioning that to a homeless outreach worker, a social worker, et cetera, would likely result in cost savings. So that's an area where I could see the budget declining. But if we, and I am supporting the ballot measure to reform our police review board, if that is enacted, and I believe that it will, I've committed to making sure that we properly fund that new independent police review board, because the staffing, the investigators, the subpoena power, the attorneys will all cost significantly more. And I think that that is a wise investment. I think that that is worth the cost, because I believe it will boost the public's trust in our police department. I also agree with Councilmember Bree that additional training is necessary for our police officers. I think many of you have seen the social media memes comparing the amount of training provided to police officers compared to other professions, hairstylists, et cetera. And people find that confusing, right? And I would agree that additional training is necessary. That's an additional cost. So when I look at this, and remember I was chair of the budget committee for 6 years, I see things that will cost less. I see things that will cost more. And what our commitment has to be is to do policing in a way that maintains safety in our neighborhoods, but is more reflective of the demands of the public. And the public is demanding change. And the question is whether or not the next mayor and council will hear those calls for change. I'm committed to making sure that we work through a process to deliver a city budget, specifically a police department budget, that reflects what they want to see from their city in 2021.
One of those specific calls for change deals with an ordinance that community members are calling PROTECT, which stands for Preventing Over-Policing Through Equitable Community Treatment. Two of the things that would do is ban consent searches and end pretext stops. What are your opinions on that particular measure, Todd?
So I've met with Bishop Bowser and some of the community folks who are recommending that, and I think that there's a lot there. My campaign has drafted a racial justice platform that is inclusive of some of the elements of that plan. It also takes a broader view, and I think this is extremely important. When we talk about the inequities in our society in general, or in San Diego specifically, this is not just contained to the police department. You see inequities in education, you see inequities in housing. We just discussed that just a moment ago. And so the plan is much more comprehensive. But with regard to particularly the gang registry, which I think could use improvements. There's state law that recommends this. Whether or not the city's implementing that, I think is a question that is worthy of further exploration. And the pretext stops, which we know is disproportionately focused on Black and brown communities, particularly Black men. That's the kind of inequity that we have to address. If you're pulling people over in Southeast for a particular transgression, you better be pulling people over the same reason in La Jolla. And I think what we don't have is a confidence that that's what currently is occurring. If that's the case, then that has to stop.
So yeah, the POA though supports the use of pretext stops. I say it's a pretty valuable tool. So just to be clear, on this measure, you've talked to Bowser. So you support what they're proposing, or you're kind of adopting a wait and see attitude?
I mean, it's a wait and see attitude. I mean, we are in agreement that change has to come. There are elements of that plan that I think are embraceable today. I think there's some that I have to, work with them more on to understand how we're going to implement. But it's a commitment to understanding what they're talking about, which is the different, in the course of this campaign, you go to certain neighborhoods in San Diego where they say they never see a police officer. And then you go to other parts of the city where they say they're over-policed. That's what I think Bishop Bowser and others are reacting to. And so that gets to the question of, okay, well, how are we doing this? Matt, if elected, I'd be the first person of color elected mayor of San Diego. I don't sit in that seat without the lived experience of someone who was sat down by their parents and we had the conversation, right? I understand that. I'm bringing that with me to the office, and I'm committed to following through on making sure that we create, again, a national model when it comes to policing. We're not going to wait for there to be a tragedy in our city limits to actually decide to do something about police reform. We're going to be proactive in that regard, and we're going to do it in partnership with those who are calling for change and those who will have to actually be a part of that change. That is, I think, one of the unique skill sets that I have of bringing people together to get forward progress. That's why I'm hopeful that we can be a city that leads on this issue, is not reactive on this issue.
Barbara, where are you on this measure dealing with stops and searches?
So I'm committed to looking at the data. I mean, the data has indicated there is racial disparity in policing. I'm committed to looking at the data and working with the community to make sure that everyone feels safe in their neighborhood. And that's different neighborhood by neighborhood. I mean, if you're on Garnett Avenue, at 1 a.m. On a Saturday, early morning, they would like a police presence there as people come out of bars and often get into fights and there's sexual assaults. I mean, so they would like a police presence, in Pacific Beach, on Friday and Saturday nights. Someone in another neighborhood may not feel safe walking down the street because they may feel the police officer is going to come up and stop them unnecessarily. So I want to work with the community to understand what public safety looks like in each neighborhood. And as mayor, implement a plan that recognizes that each neighborhood is unique. Each neighborhood needs something different. That's why we have neighborhood policing, so that police officers get to know a community, get to know the residents. And that's how we will end up with a safe city for everybody.
Matt, I think it's important to note the data already exists, right? We have the SDSU study from, I believe, 2015 or 2016. The ACLU has issued a study showing this information. I guess that's perhaps why I'm more embracing of this need for reform, because the data shows that there is different experiences of law enforcement in our city, depending on what you look like and where you live. We don't have to research this further. We have this information. It is just that there's not been a willingness to do much about it until now.
As a journalist in California for 30 years, it's always amazed me that progressive Democrats don't figure out, like Shirley Weber has, that it's incompatible to be a progressive Democrat and to support teachers unions and police unions. It's incomprehensible that we're at this point in 2020 and progressives still think that they have something to gain by being allied with teachers unions and police unions. I'd like to hear what each of you hear about this, think about this topic, because it's mind-boggling. The progressive movement bases its support it depends on so much support from totally reactionary institutions like police unions and teachers unions.
Well, none of them have endorsed me for mayor, Chris. So the special interests are endorsing my opponent.
Chris, you have seen myself, my fellow Democrats on the city council and the legislature move forward with reforms without the support of some of those folks, right? You know, when I served on the education committee, I was a very even hand in supporting both charters and traditional schools. I supported a bill that on the assembly floor that modified teacher tenure. I supported AB 392, authored by Dr. Weber. I have Dr. Weber's endorsement in this campaign. And I guess that goes back to my point of being supported by some of the folks that you are maybe not a fan of, as well as the people on the other side of the conversation from them, like Dr. Weber. You know, in understanding that I would be the best person for this job. You know, you have seen me, the most recent police commission reforms were something that I worked on with Council President Cole. That did not enjoy the endorsement of the POA, and we moved forward, and the voters of San Diego ratified that with over 80% of the vote. So I have shown an openness to talk to both sides, and I guess that's the thing, is that in this line of work, you're supposed to be listening to everybody, figuring out what the best path forward is, and going forward. And I will stand my record up for being willing to put politics aside and move this city forward against anyone, including my opponent in this race.
Well, Chris, let's go back and look at the police reform measure that Mr. Gloria sponsored in 2018. At that time, Women Occupy San Diego, I believe, or something similar, met with him and offered similar to what will be on the November ballot, which is an independent commission that can investigate and subpoena. And he would not support it. Would have been nice if it had passed way back in, I guess, 2016, if it had passed before I even joined the city council. Then in 2018, I did vote to put it on the ballot, standing up to the police union, and but it did not have enough votes. Then, because the environment around us has changed with the tragic murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, it was supported unanimously by the city council to go on the November ballot. I have demonstrated over and over again that I have the courage and independence to stand up to special interests when necessary, and I will continue. I have done it on the city council, and I will continue to do it as mayor.
And I have a question I'd like to go back
to. Let me just, 30 seconds, Todd. Do you want to talk about 2016 and Women Occupy?
Right, so it was said 2018, which is not accurate, it's 2016. And that particular ballot measure was endorsed by a lot of the folks who are supporting the new measure today. That was endorsed by the Earl Gilliam Bar Association. We worked with those folks to force something that we could actually get done. You know, I look at the host of things that have not gotten done over the last number of years. You know, sensible vacation rental legislation has not become law in San Diego because of the unwillingness to get to something that we can get on the books. You know, time and again, you saw me maybe fail in the first attempt, but come back and get it done. Whether that was additional affordable housing funding, minimum wage increases, you know, continually coming back and moving the ball forward. And that's what this year's ballot measure is about. And I've already committed very clearly that I will faithfully implement it as mayor if elected.
Right. And I'm very honored that Andrea St. Julian, the president of the Earl B. Gilliam Bar Association, has endorsed me for mayor.
Laura, you had a question.
Yes, I'd like to go back to the subject of San Diego police just for a minute and ask both of you, under your watch, what would happen if someone who is undocumented in the city of San Diego gets stopped by a San Diego police officer for a broken taillight? Should they be expected to be deported?
No.
No.
How would the San Diego, under your watch, how would San Diego police work with ICE or not work with ICE?
Under a state law, SB 54, our police officers are tasked with protecting our residents and not doing federal immigration enforcement. That is not their job.
Under my administration, we would follow state law. And again, go back to a time when we were a national leader. You know, I represented City Heights for many years on the city council. It was understood that having this barrier between law enforcement and the community was a way to actually make us less safe. That was understood, you know, 30 years ago. understanding, underlining, emphasizing that, and making that clear to the public and to our police department would be important to make sure that folks feel as though when they're in the need of help, that they can call with confidence and get an appropriate response, one that doesn't involve federal law enforcement.
Right. And Tom Wong, a professor at UCSD, has done extensive research documenting that immigrant communities are very safe and that keeping federal law enforcement separate makes community members more likely to feel safe, more likely to come forward if they're the victim of a crime, which is very important. If they're the victim of rape or robbery, we want everyone to feel safe to come forward to law enforcement.
Do you really feel that people in certain neighborhoods in San Diego live that way?
No.
I understand many people may not live that way, but as mayor, this is how I will lead our city, and I will make it clear that our police officers do not do the work of ICE.
The answer is no, Laura. It's not, I think, it's no. And that's regrettable, but that's very much a function of the federal administration and the rhetoric that's there. And I think also the lack of vocal opposition to that at the local level. I think that the current mayoral administration often will talk about immigration in the form of economics. It doesn't talk about immigration in the form of people, right? That we live binational lifestyles, that people cross freely and frequently for legitimate reasons, and that the kinds of policies we've seen at the federal level doesn't just harm the region's bottom line, although it does, but that it impacts the lives of individuals. I think the mayor of San Diego, as the leader of the largest border city in the United States, will have a responsibility nationally to articulate what sensible immigration policy looks like. And you have seen throughout my time in public office a willingness to do that. And I will embrace that role as mayor, recognizing I think what you're alluding to is the fact that a large segment of our community is directly impacted by this, and either silence on a local level or the toxic rhetoric at a national level is impacting them every single day and impacting their quality of life and their willingness to understand whether or not they're a full-fledged member of this community or not. I'm running to be a mayor for everybody. I want a city that works for all of us, and that is inclusive of our immigrant community and our communities of color.
The LA Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post have all reported that over the last 20 years, there's been a decline in use of mass transit. Yet San Diego is pursuing these plans, the SANDAG, pursuing these plans that presume that there will be a massive embrace of mass transit. When are we going to be honest about how people behave and how they perceive and how much they love their cars?
Todd, why don't you go first?
Sure. I just want to hug Chris. I just want to. Chris, I hear what you're saying, but some of this conversation has already kind of set this up. As we discuss concentrating new home growth in existing communities closer to jobs and existing infrastructure, we're going to be shifting the way that people get around. Now, I'm not a car hater. I mean, if you want to own a car, that's your business. It's a free country. But what we have to do is give people more choices when it comes from getting from A to B. And what is being suggested by SANDAG, it's not been ratified yet, but it's what they're considering, is giving our world-class community a world-class transportation system, one that features choice as a part of what we will do. And I think that that will be necessary. Now, this is a contrasting issue in this race. And I would point out that whatever is adopted, if it were adopted today, will take a significant amount of time to actually construct, to actually build. And so the longer we wait, the less likely anything is to happen. Again, later becomes never in this town, right? And what I'm saying is that we need to make the investment in our infrastructure in order to preserve the quality of life that we all love as our community. This is going to be a system that is flexible, that is, again, features choice as a function, as a hallmark of the plan. And I think it's going to be so necessary, not just for quality of life, but also for our environment. And look around us today to understand what the climate crisis is doing to our community. So I embrace this idea of choice when it comes to transportation. I think that right now, San Diegans really have just one way to get around. And I don't think that's what people want. I think increasingly I hear from constituents, they want that choice. And that work has to start today. Think about in 1915, if the San Diegans of that era simply said, you know, putting on a World's Fair is just too much trouble. It's going to be, you know, a waste of time and effort. We look back on that generation of San Diegans with appreciation for the vision that they had for our community. I'm suggesting that we should hold that level of that expectation for us and helping to actually start something that maybe 100 years from now, people will say, by God, thank God they made that investment, because I can't imagine what our community would look like if we did not have a robust pedestrian, bicycle, mass transit, and car infrastructure system.
Chris, this is a very serious issue, and it's an area in which my opponent and I have a disagreement. I think $177 billion is a frightening number. There's some things in the 5 big moves that I like, but I think the idea of building fixed rail and ripping up our neighborhoods is a 19th century solution. Let me tell you what's going on at UCSD, which I think is the future. So first of all, they are testing autonomous vehicles on the campus. I view the future as smart highways with autonomous vehicles. I view the future as the light rail that we already have in place. I'm thinking, and the blue line that is going to connect downtown to the UTC area, which is our #1 job center, will be done by the end of 2021. And we need to prove that we can make this work. And what UCSD is doing at the Voight station on the campus is they are designing it so that autonomous vehicles can line up there. So one might say Salk Institute, one might say engineering building, one might say UCSD library. So you could get in the autonomous vehicle and zip off to your final destination. Solving the first mile, last mile issues are really, really important all along our transit. And I don't think that scooters and skateboards are the way to do it. What I see is a system of, you could call them jitneys or trams. And one of the first things I did as a council member, since UCSD and the UTC areas in my council district, was I convened a meeting with Sandag, MTS, and the major employers in that area to talk about the last mile issue. How were they going to get people from the trolley to their final destination? Before I'd convened these meetings, they were doing nothing to think about what the world was going to look like in the fall of 2021. One of the other things I'm very focused on is making sure we have job centers closer to where people live, closer to where housing is more affordable, closer to where we already have good transit. 2 things. It's been a vision of mine for years to have a major tech and biotech center downtown. We already have good transit coming into downtown from the south and from the east, and we can supplement it with high-speed buses, with internet. Let's add amenities. Biotech is coming downtown more quickly than I ever could have imagined. The Manchester complex is in escrow to a new REIT, a new real estate investment trust called IQHQ. The founder is Alan Gold, who was Biomed Realty. I have talked with him, and his plans are to have a biotech center downtown. This is a game changer for our region, and why I believe I am the best mayor at this moment in time. This is the world I spent 30 years in, and we need to make sure that these companies have a link between what they're doing on site and to the community, making sure they're offering paid internships, particularly to young people growing up south of 8. One of my other ideas for moving jobs closer to where people live and where housing is more affordable is a biopharmaceutical manufacturing center in the South Bay. We already have a biotech manufacturing center in North County, in San Marcos and the Oceanside area. With the pandemic, there is going to be a push to move more pharmaceutical manufacturing back to the United States. We have zoned industrial land in Otay Mesa. We have the advantage that almost every pharmaceutical company in the world has done something in San Diego. They've invested in a biotech. They bought a biotech. They're funding research here. They know San Diego. Our community colleges in the north area of the county have certificate programs in biotech manufacturing. So I'm thinking about what this region, what this city is going to look like in the 21st century, and moving forward and not doing things which are 19th century solutions.
How are you figuring the pandemic into this? Go ahead, Todd.
with regard to transit, the pandemic?
Oh, just overall, we're talking about transit, we're talking about housing, we're talking about major office developments. Right now, you know, those needs have really changed. So going forward, how do you see the pandemic affecting your administration and this city?
Let me hop in on that, but I just want to make sure that we're very clear. You know, the status quo plan that Councilmember Bree is endorsing is $130+ billion, right? And in exchange for that, you get basically what we have today. What I'm saying is that we need to have a bigger vision for our community, that, you know, it doesn't matter if it's an autonomous vehicle or a human-driven vehicle, it's still going to sit in traffic. And the question becomes whether or not you're getting the mode share shift that is necessary to meet our climate goals, but also to reduce the amount of traffic that San Diegans are going to have to sit in. That's a difference, right? And particularly as we put, and I think it's fantastic, as the former council member for downtown, as you see the change for Horton Plaza, for the Navy Broadway complex, you're gonna bring a lot more people and a lot more jobs down there. And again, it doesn't matter what type of vehicle they're sitting in, they're gonna sit in traffic. The question becomes, how do you get more people out in the, around in a manner, in a time that's appropriate, in a manner that improves our environment, doesn't diminish it. Christy, to your question, yeah, I mean, that's part of why I think I may be sitting here, right? You know, you all made an endorsement in the primary, but the world has changed significantly. And obviously, defeating COVID-19 has to be a top priority. Now, the city doesn't have a public health department, but the city can play a role in this. And so I think short term, what I would say is that obviously there has been some success in the sense that we are the only county in Southern California that is at tier 2. But there are also real challenges. Our schools are not open today, right? And so we're not meeting people's expectations. Additionally, too many businesses are faltering or will fail, and that's going to create major challenges. The economy and the recession that is here now and is likely to be here for some time, I think calls for someone with my skill set and background that's proven that you can lead the city through a recession. To how this is going to change going forward. You know, Christy, I think you're going to see a number of changes. I think that as we look at these vacant storefronts and empty office buildings, conversion of those properties to the much needed residences and homes that we need as a community is going to be important. I think Sacramento may provide some streamlining efforts to assist with that, but there's nothing that would stop San Diego from helping to lead on it. I think that as people, you know, shelter in place and maybe travel less, I don't think people are going to be exclusively working from home. I think a lot of people are going to be happy to get out of their houses with some more frequency, but maybe looking for more balance. Well, then that means that you need more amenities in particular neighborhoods. So you're going to need communities that aren't food deserts, that have the kinds of businesses and retail that they can get, and then also the need to facilitate delivery services so they're not blocking streets and that they're not congesting neighborhood residential streets as they try and make their deliveries. It's going to cause a lot of change. And I think that this is an area where a bigger vision for our city is needed, as opposed to this, you know, I think much more of a status quo approach. Lastly, I would say I want to, if I can use this as an opportunity to talk about where we could do better as a community when it comes to COVID-19. You know, I think that when you see these sort of haphazard approach to opening and closing beaches, I think is an indication that we could do better as a city when it comes to managing this. You know, the city was the first to shut down its beaches. It did it without consultation with other cities in the state, causing folks to concentrate in those other areas, and I think actually not helping the public health case. And then the reverse was true when they were reopened before those other cities, again, not coordinating. I think that's a problem that we have to improve upon. I think the fact that the city and the county hold separate press conferences to make announcements is a mistake. There should be no daylight between the city and the county when it comes to messaging on COVID-19. I think these areas of small discrepancies are areas that allow the public to lack trust for what they're being told. And so if we don't look like we can handle beach closures or reopenings, they're going to question our recommendations when it comes to face covering and social distancing and reopening and closings of other businesses. We have to be in the business of boosting public trust. And I think some of what has been done to date is problematic. Last thing I would say is that I'm very concerned about the closure of the convention center. I think the city is on track to shut down that as a shelter long before the public health order has been lifted, before conventions want to move into the convention center. And we're going to create a situation where we have the potential for hundreds of unsheltered San Diegans to be ushered back onto our city streets. That would be a tragedy and something that this mayor and council should do everything to avoid. I would certainly try to avoid it if I was the mayor.
Barbara?
Thank you. Our world is going to be very different because of the pandemic. And I have written a detailed roadmap to recovery, which I did with a diverse group of small business owners and community leaders. And it sounds like my opponent has read my report. First of all, we've seen that thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, including many city employees, are working effectively remotely. I want the city to be a model of how to have an effective remote workforce for positions where it is appropriate. And this needs to be a regional strategy which will reduce congestion on the freeways, improve air quality, and allow us to reach our climate action plan goals more quickly while providing many families with flexibility that they want. So first, remote workforce. Second, I think my private sector experience is so important. During the pandemic, tech and biotech not only continued working, they continued hiring. So did the military, aerospace, construction, shipbuilding. These are industries we should focus on growing. They create good jobs. Not all of the jobs require a college degree. And then they support service sector jobs around them. This is where I spent 30 years of my life, in the tech and biotech worlds, and I'm going to focus on growing these industries. While there is a shortage, while there's many companies are finding that they don't need office space or as much office space, biotech does need space. They need research space. And we have a shortage of biotech research space, which is why downtown is going to become the next center of biotech. It's an industry where you need to go in person. Third, creative reuse of buildings, of office buildings, of commercial, can be turned into housing. That is a result of the pandemic. And as we use data, make sure we use data in all of the decisions. I was very frustrated during the pandemic. You could go to Costco or Target, you could buy a piece of clothing, you could buy a book, you could buy furniture, but you couldn't go to your neighborhood retailer, where you probably could have shopped very safely with a face mask, socially distanced. It disproportionately hurts small business. And I want to make sure going forward that we use data as we decide on what gets opened and what doesn't, and that we monitor the results very, very carefully. Some of the other key parts of my roadmap to recovery, of something that I was working on long before the pandemic came around, is universal internet access. Everybody needs it. Young people, old people, families need it for learning, for healthcare, for shopping, for social interaction. I've already been working on a plan. We haven't leveraged the relationships with Cox, Spectrum, and the other service providers. We basically give them everything they want without getting something back for our community. And tourism, you know, it's going to continue to be important. How can we focus on tourism, cultural tourism, and other ways to get back individual tourists? Because it's going to be a long time. As I've been talking to industry leaders, they do not expect conventions or corporate meetings to start in any meaningful way until mid-year 2021.
Since you both brought up conventions, obviously homelessness is a huge issue. The pandemic didn't change that. San Diego's won some props for having a good solution. It seems like the convention center has worked. There hasn't been an outbreak of significance there, and more people are getting housed and services. But that's going to close, as Todd said, at some point. What would homelessness? How would homelessness be addressed under your administrations starting on day one? Are there bridge shelters? Is the convention center open? What does it look like? Barbara, why don't you go first?
So first of all, I have not been briefed on when the convention center might or might not close. I think it's important to keep it open as long as we need it, given that conventions aren't coming back anytime soon. What the convention center has shown is it's been better city-county collaboration than we've had in the past. What it's shown is that when we get individuals into a central place, we're able to provide them with social services and get them into the type of program they need to be successful over the long term. The data that I've shown has indicated that a number of people have entered substance and mental health programs. Some people have been reunited with their families. Other people have been helped to get a job and move into permanent housing, and as mayor, my homeless plan starts on dealing with the root causes, which for a growing number of people is mental health and substance abuse. And that's why Father Joe has endorsed me. If we don't address those in a meaningful way in a structured program, these individuals will not be successful over the long term.
So where will they be?
Mayor, this is what I will focus on.
I'm sorry. So where will the homeless population, where do homeless people live?
So we, first of all, we after the pandemic ends, we still have 4 bridge shelters that can house around 800 people. It may be fewer people if we decide we need fewer in each location. Second, the city is getting money from the state program Operation Project Room Key to buy hotels. And I've spoken with the San Diego Housing Commission. They expect that we will be able to buy at least 500 hotel rooms over the next few months, most of them with kitchenettes so that they are, can be lived in immediately by families. Third, we are, under this council building much more subsidized housing, and I think over 1,000 units are coming online in the next 6 months. So it will be a combination of factors, but starting with addressing the root causes, holding the county accountable for mental health and substance abuse programs.
Todd?
Sure. So what does it look like first day? I mean, as a practical matter, it sounds to me as though the city's going to close the convention center. They're going to transition folks back to tents in the Golden Hall. Maybe some, if they can acquire the hotel properties the state is helping to finance. But I'm concerned there's going to be a delta, and there shouldn't be a delta. We should work collaboratively to make sure that anyone who is currently housed at the convention center stays housed. I'd point out that we don't have the number of bridge shelters that was mentioned a moment ago. It's my understanding at least one of those went to Chula Vista. I'm not sure that every provider is still going to participate in this program going forward. And again, that presents a challenge to tell a group of folks to stay home in order to avoid getting sick while simultaneously taking away their shelter. Matt, I think you know that I've long been uncomfortable with the tent structures, that a temporary tent is not a home, and it's obviously better than the street. But we as a community should have an expectation to house people in appropriate housing, and that should continue to be our goal. Voters of San Diego will have a chance to weigh in on a housing bond measure that could potentially help us finance additional rooms, beds, homes to house some of these individuals. We should be vigorous in lobbying in Sacramento and Washington, D.C. to get our fair share of funding. But ultimately, what we have to do is make this a leadership issue. And Matt, I appreciate you asking this question because we had a homelessness crisis before the pandemic. We have one still today, and we're likely to have a worse one after the pandemic. The question is, are you going to have the leadership that has the experience working on this particular issue to bring the transformational change that we must have if we want to make progress on this issue? I've committed to making sure that this is a high priority in my administration, that we will hold providers accountable and demand transparency when it comes to how they're housing or not housing the homeless. Those who can show progress will get more funding. Those who can't will get less or none. That we have to have a close relationship with the county. My opponent does not support housing first, which is a national best practice. I do, and I think by working with the county, with their behavioral health services, marrying it with our housing commission, that housing plus services is how you end homelessness. Proud to have the endorsement of County Supervisor Nathan Fletcher in this race. I believe that we can work together to create the kind of relationship that's going to be necessary to transition people off the streets. And then we have to work collaboratively with other cities. If Chula Vista got one of our tents, we're gonna have to make sure that what they're doing aligns with our priorities so that we're working in a coordinated fashion. You know, a third of our homeless are not in the city of San Diego. They're in the other cities in the unincorporated areas. So if you're just looking at the city, you're looking too small. You need to look bigger. And lastly, and this again is a dividing issue in this race, we have to have more housing. Because for many of these folks, they are not suffering from a mental illness or a substance abuse problem. They are the working poor. They're living in their cars. They're living in other places because they can't afford a place to live. And again, the kinds of rhetoric we've heard in this campaign is necessarily undermining of the effort to explain to people why we need more homes for really everybody, but including the working poor and those who may currently be homeless despite having employment.
Thank you. Well, let me be clear. I do oppose housing first. It's a flawed policy. When Mr. Gloria was sworn in for a second term on the city council, he promised to end chronic homelessness downtown in 4 years. I have data in front of me from the downtown partnership, which surveys unsheltered people downtown every month. In December of 2012, that number was 593. In December of 2016, at the end of Mr. Gloria's term, it was 1,415. It more than doubled. In August, that number is 559, this August. It is gone down by more than half. Housing first is a flawed policy. We must address underlying issues, treat each person as an individual. We have a system that is not seamless today. There should be one phone number you can call to get the help that you need. Let me explain to you what happened to me on election day. I was in Nestor, standing in front of a community park. A man walked up to me and he said, "I'm homeless, can you help me?" I called 211 San Diego, where I was put on hold and passed through to a number of different people, all of whom wanted to give me different phone numbers to call. If I was really homeless, do you think I would be able to deal with all of this? I mean, because I'm a council member, I was able to get this gentleman into the Alpha Project, where he's getting the help he needs. What he told me was that he had lost his job, his wife had divorced him, he was living with his sister, he had gotten violent, his sister had dropped him off about a mile away, she couldn't deal with him anymore. He said, "I'm drinking too much, I'm an alcoholic, I want help." And at the Alpha Project, he is getting the help that he needs. There should have been one phone number, one place I could call to get help for this gentleman, and there was not.
On the issue of housing, let me just make sure I have your positions clear on Measure A, the $900 million housing bond. So Todd, you support that?
I do.
And Barbara?
I supported putting it on the ballot. As you know, I voted to put it on the ballot. I knew I was the swing vote, and I thought it was important that San Diego voters get to weigh in on it. I have not yet decided how I personally am going to vote on it.
How are you going to make that decision?
I'm going to make that decision. I'm talking to homeowners and property owners about the impact it's going to have on them. On the day that the council voted to put it on the ballot, you may remember that some of my colleagues, particularly Monica Montgomery and Vivian Moreno, expressed concerns about the impact it would have on homeowners in their council districts.
We're kind of winding down on time, but I wanted to ask you some questions about climate change. That is arguably the biggest issue facing humanity. It's been overshadowed by the pandemic. Specifically on the, let me kind of segment some complicated issues in as simple questions as I can. The franchise agreement, should that be extended in the short term with SDG&E so that we have more time to not mess up a very important decision? Barbara, since you're on the council, why don't you go first?
Yeah, so I've consistently voted no on the issues related to the franchise agreement. To me, this is another example of a rushed process. In January, San Diego Gas and Electric still has to deliver gas and electric services to all of the residents of the city of San Diego. They can't simply walk away. And if you saw the discussion at the city council, you realize there was no consensus on what we were legally allowed to put in the invitation to bid or what we wanted to put in the invitation to bid, a clear indication that more education and time is needed. After I did all of this, the city attorney actually released an opinion saying, yeah, we could take more time. San Diego Gas and Electric can't simply walk away. And this is one of the most important decisions we're going to make. The current administration got started on the process late, but we can simply extend San Diego Gas and Electric for another year and get it right.
So you support doing that?
Yes.
And why didn't you, as a council member in City Hall, send up a warning signal or a red flag or ask that this huge issue be handled earlier? Like, that's partly your responsibility too, right? It's not just the mayor's.
Yes, well, as soon as when the mayor's staff came to me when they were starting on it, I said, delay. I didn't see the urgency. We were in a it just didn't, they were starting on it late. I didn't see the urgency. San Diego Gas and Electric could continue providing its services. It was something that should be handled by the next mayor and the new city council. And there are going to be a lot of new council members.
Yeah. Todd, what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's difficult to claim that this is rushed when they had 50 years to prepare for it. Maybe that gets to Chris's comments earlier. You know, yes, they should take the time to do it right. I think a short-term extension in order to provide certainty to San Diegans is appropriate. But I would note that this is not without risk or without cost, and the potential for the city's franchise revenue, which is a significant part of our budget picture, being impacted because of delays is not without risk. But as someone that is being asked, as asking for a job to balance different sides, I think the need to get this deal right with the potential risk on revenues is there. Listen, we have to get this right. We know what San Diegans deserve to have certainty when it comes to how their homes are energized. And this is part and parcel of what the city council should be doing today. I suspect it will fall into the next mayor's hands, and I will do my very best to create an agreement with whoever the winning bidder is that helps advance our climate action goals.
Go ahead.
Councilmember Bree, you've talked over and over again, quite accurately, about the fact that the city rushes into these decisions on big matters. Yet you were critical of the city attorney for her warning that SDSU West was being dealt with too rapidly. How do you reconcile those two stands?
First of all, it took 18 months to get the SDSU West deal done, and there were special interests trying to torpedo the deal all the way along after the voters passed it. I think part of the problem was there was no one in the room who was in the negotiating room who was the client being the voters of San Diego. So in life, the client drives the negotiations, not the attorneys. And I was not in the negotiating room because the council was excluded. Normally, the independent budget analyst sits in on labor negotiations as the council's representative. The IBA was prohibited from sitting in on the negotiations for SDSU West. Last summer, you may recall, Scott Sherman and I stood together and said, let's get all of this out in public. And I think what was frustrating is if there were all these differences happening in, these closed negotiating sessions, all of that should have been brought to the attention of the public much more quickly so that we all could have known what those differences are, so we could have held both parties accountable for resolving them. There was one public meeting where we got to vote on some issues where the council did add direction, but it should have been done sooner and more often. There was no reason for it to take 18 months to get to finish this deal. It finally got done, quite frankly, because we were in the middle of a pandemic. We were facing a budget shortfall, and I think it was going to be embarrassing to tell voters that we hadn't completed the sale, which was going to result in about $88 million to the city of San Diego, and why we might have to close libraries or parks or make some other budget cuts because we hadn't, taken advantage of closing this transaction, which also, took a liability off the city of having to operate the site every month. So in the real world, you'd, get all of the issues out in public, you'd air it, and you'd reach a conclusion.
Another energy question, complicated one. We're not gonna have time to do it justice. CCAs. We've criticized Faulkner on a lot of things, but he left some off-ramps for the city. As we proceed on that, is your support of CCAs kind of full-throated, or do you, we're seeing other cities raise questions about costs and whether the costs will be similar to what they would pay under SDG&E, even though there are some benefits to, trying to have a menu that includes more renewables, et cetera, et cetera. Again, a complex issue. I guess I just want to see where you differ on that. So Todd, for you first, how complete is your support of that?
Complete. As the author of the city's climate action plan, the CCA is a central part of the goals and objectives that are there. Of course, this has to be done right. I think that it's been encouraging that other jurisdictions have joined San Diego to work collectively to both spread the benefits and the risk amongst these different jurisdictions. PCAs are not unicorns. They exist, right? They exist successfully in places like Sacramento and elsewhere. There's no reason that this cannot be successful here in San Diego. And I'm fully committed to making sure that we implement the climate action plan faithfully. I think we've lost some ground over the last number of years. It's time to make that up. It's not to do it rashly, but it's to do it responsibly. Again, other communities have done this successfully. There's no reason San Diego can't as well.
Barbara?
I voted to support the establishment of San Diego Community Power. As mayor, I will hold it accountable for its promise of investing in renewable sources of energy and in lowering electric bills for San Diegans.
How do you ensure on the climate action plan, how do you ensure that those goals are met? Obviously, that's a legally binding document, but as we've seen, there are components in there that, you know, the city's not hitting its marks across the board. So Todd, to you, how do you ensure that those marks are being hit?
Well, you lead, right? It's going to take a strong relationship with the council, with city workers, with our partners at Sandag and MTS, with the folks at Community Power to get this done. And again, I think that's a hallmark of my leadership style, of being decisive, of moving forward, of bringing different groups together to get this done. It's not going to be by opposing new forms of transportation, shutting down bike lane expansions, the kinds of stuff that are going to help us hit those targets. That's what has happened over the last 4 or 6 years. It's going to require a different approach. It's going to take using every bit of the responsibilities under Assembly Bill 805 to make sure that we're getting our fair share of resources at Sandag. It's going to take a lot of work. But Matt, it's worth doing. I mean, how many triple digits days are we going to put up with in San Diego? What kind of diminishment of our quality of life are we willing to accept? I'm not willing to accept that. I'm willing to fight hard to protect the quality of life that set us apart as San Diegans, and the climate action plan is central to doing that.
Barbara?
As mayor, I will be accountable for making sure that we meet our climate action plan goals, and I will work with the council and the community and business to make sure that we do it. And I have the courage and independence to stand up and say unpopular things when necessary. I've demonstrated over and over again that I will do it. I think that there are economic opportunities that will come out of moving ahead with meeting our climate action plan goals, with making San Diego an entrepreneurial center for businesses, for services that will help communities all over the world meet their climate action plan goals. I think that's why my private sector experience as an entrepreneur is so important. As many of you know, I worked at the Connect program in the early days, from 86 to 96. Connect was formed to help high-tech and biotech companies get started. I was there at the beginning and worked with hundreds of companies. Back then, I could have named all the companies on 2 hands. And there are industries today I never even dreamed of: precision medicine, bioalgae, cybersecurity. What's going on in San Diego is so exciting, and we're going to continue to innovate, to develop new industries that help people all over the world. Just think, during the pandemic, San Diego biotech companies have been at the forefront of developing vaccines, therapeutics, making test kits, making ventilators. This is happening in our city, and we have so much more opportunity ahead of us with the right mayor who recognizes how to harness the private sector to work together effectively with government.
Before we go to closing remarks, I just want to see if the board members have any questions on this or any other subject, because we're at the end of the cycle here.
I wish we had another half hour.
I'm sure that I answered the question if you got one.
I'd like to know, going back to the transportation issue in the trolley, just really briefly, before the pandemic, when's the last time either one of you were on the trolley?
I'm an alternate to MTS, and I used to take the trolley. If I needed to go to the MTS building, I'd usually walk one way and take the trolley one way. And, you know, I haven't been much of anywhere in the last 6 months.
Oh, I said prior to the pandemic.
Prior. Just given my life, I don't live anywhere near public transit, and I go downtown, you know, from my house to downtown and home and out in the community in the evenings. And we don't have a transit system that's effective for me. and I think effective for many people, given the topography of San Diego with canyons and hills. I grew up in Philadelphia, which is a very flat city. So it made building fixed rail much more easily, which is why I question Sandag's, focus on building all of this new fixed rail. It doesn't make sense given San Diego's topography. But the Blue Line is going to be coming, connecting downtown to the UTC area. That's about 4 miles from my house. So you could have a jitney service in my neighborhood on Mount Soledad, connecting residents to the Trolley to go either south to downtown or north up to the UTC area. So as that fixed rail is done, that would make sense. The jitney service, the tram service, I see the first mile, last mile issues with our existing transit, getting it to work more effectively.
Laura, I can't give you the exact date, but I actually live just a couple of blocks from the Washington Street trolley stop. My office is on that same trolley line, so it works pretty good for me. I think my contribution to alternative transportation is that I live in Mission Hills. I'm able to walk to my grocery store. I'm able to walk to my favorite restaurants. And so, in many ways, I'm situated to live out this climate action plan goal. And I don't disagree with Councilmember Bree. I guess the difference is I'm interested in building a system that actually does work for people. And my frustration is that we've spent billions to create a system that doesn't work. It's time to have a different approach. It's time to not spend billions on a trolley system and an airport that are next to each other, yet they don't connect. And this is the kind of leadership that I want to bring to create a world-class transportation system for a world-class city.
I just wanted to kind of remind both of you that the people that ride the trolley are very much people that live day to day in San Diego, and not all of them are educated and not all of them make the kind of money to live comfortably in San Diego, but that is your population in San Diego, and hopefully whoever becomes mayor won't forget about them. That's the real San Diego, those people on the trolley.
Thank you, Laura. You're absolutely right.
Any last questions, anyone? Seeing none, why don't we do 2 minutes each for closing remarks? And Todd, why don't you go first?
Sure. Well, I just thank you so much for your time this morning. I know these are unusual times. Some of you may be schooling your children currently, and yet you gave us 90 minutes of your time. I'm grateful. I asked for the endorsement of the UT. I was honored to have it in the primary. I hope to have it again here in the general election. I think you all know that I'm running to be the mayor of San Diego as a third-generation San Diegan who knows where our city has been, as the son of a maid and a gardener who knows how hard it is for working people to make ends meet in a town as expensive as San Diego. And importantly, as someone who has a vision for where I'd like to take our city. We have many challenges: housing affordability, homelessness, infrastructure, the pandemic, the recession. These are all issues, but the broader issue is what I've already raised, is that too often we are a big city that likes to operate like a small town, and it's time to change that approach. I have shown throughout my career that I have the experience capable of leading the city in a new direction. I chaired the city's budget committee for 6 years. I helped lead us out of a recession, turn deficits into surpluses, and to fill our reserves that are going to help us get through these next difficult years. You have seen me lead in Sacramento and be able to come back with relationships that will help move our city forward and get our fair share of state and federal resources. And importantly, you've seen me do this job. I did it for 8 months. I can do it for 8 years. And I asked for this opportunity. San Diegans are, I believe, crystal clear in wanting a change, whether it comes to the inequities in our housing policy to the ways that we police. And I'm prepared to be the mayor who truly leads in tackling these problems head on. I've brought together the broadest, most diverse coalition of supporters that anyone has seen running for mayor of San Diego. And it's that coalition that will take these from being words to actually being action. I appreciate the opportunity to share these thoughts with you. I'm happy to answer any additional questions going forward, but I stand here today respectfully asking for your endorsement to be the next mayor of San Diego.
Thanks, Todd. Barbara.
Well, thank you all for the opportunity this morning to talk with you again. I would be very honored to have your endorsement. I've spent my life standing up for others, getting things done, and challenging the status quo. My life has been about coming up with solutions, not making empty promises. There are a few differences between my opponent and me. First, our life experiences. I've been a journalist, an entrepreneur. I've started 2 organizations that empower women, Athena San Diego and Run Women Run. I've served on several nonprofit boards. I've been a wife, a mom, and a grandma. and I believe the diversity of my life experiences has prepared me to lead our city at this moment in time. My opponent has only worked in government, either for government or as an elected official. Second, there are some key differences between my opponent and me on key issues. I do not support the elimination of single-family zoning. I believe it will lead to gentrification, and I have a detailed plan on how to address building housing that real San Diegans can afford. You didn't bring up AB 5 today, but my opponent and I do differ on it. I have called for the repeal of AB 5. It has hurt many working families, many small businesses. It shows a lack of understanding of the private sector. I believe a third category of workers should have been created, which is what England did with protections and benefits. And that would have been the right approach, not just creating a series of exemptions and having to add to the list all the time as new occupations come along. And in our world, we're going to have more and more new occupations and new fields as our economy continues to change. My priority as mayor is the economy, to lead an inclusive economic recovery, to focus on small business, to focus on growing the sectors that have continued to grow during the pandemic, to make sure that all San Diegans, particularly young people growing up south of Interstate 8, have access to these good jobs. That's why my office will include a school engagement coordinator who will develop relationships between employers and the schools, so that as young people grow up, they will understand the job opportunities available to them. And as they get older, they will have access to paid internships. I don't want you to endorse me because I'm a woman or because I'm the daughter of a working mom or because I turn a clever phrase. I want you to endorse me because I have the courage and independence to fundamentally change City Hall. I have demonstrated this courage and independence over and over again in my life. I do not have the endorsement of most of the special interests in this town. A year and a half ago, my opponent was viewed as inevitable, and they all rushed to support him. It's clear that is no longer the case. I can truly be a mayor who will be responsible to the residents, who will have the courage and independence to make the decisions that are right for our city for the long term. As I'm making these decisions, I'm thinking about my children and my grandchildren. I'm married to my second and last husband, Neil. We each brought 2 children to our marriage. We have 4 children, all of whom married people we adore. So far, we have 3 grandchildren in this area. And the blessed news in our family is we're going to have 4 more between Election Day and March, with my youngest daughter, Rachel, and her husband, Daniel, having twins in March. It's our children and our grandchildren that I'm thinking of as I make decisions for San Diego's future. This is not a stepping stone in political office for me. This is the culmination of my life in San Diego, a city that has been very good to me. And in exchange, I can lead our city to its fullest potential.
Thank you. Todd, we didn't ask about AB 5, but do you want to talk a bit about that bill? You were a co-sponsor of it, and obviously there was a companion bill rushed through that made many changes to it, and a lot of complaints and criticism about it. Do you regret that support? Do you stand by that support?
Matt, I appreciate the question. So I think the pandemic has laid bare why that piece of legislation is necessary. Access to critical benefits like unemployment insurance, paid sick leave, minimum wages, that's what that bill is about. The modifications were not rushed through. They were introduced in normal fashion at the beginning of the year. They've ended, were passed at the end of our session, and made appropriate modifications based on the experiences we've had since the enactment of AB 5. But my opponent's call to repeal AB 5 does not repeal the Dynamex decision that is in place and actually would impact more workers and of the supposed downsides that she's concerned about. Which shows a fundamental lack of understanding of this process. Ultimately, I do believe that workers should have minimum wages. They should pay into our Social Security system. They should have access to unemployment benefits and paid sick leave. And if my opponent doesn't agree with that, that's just a big difference in this race.
Okay. Thank you for indulging that one last question. And just for the record, by rushing through, I just meant that the governor signed it the day first day he
It
could
had
have
an
done it.
urgency. It had an urgency clause in it, which allowed him to do that right away.
Yeah. Thank you very much, both of you, for taking the time and going over the time. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Be
you.
well. Stay safe.
Thank you.